Hello and welcome to your geography lesson. We're going to continue looking at the landforms that rivers create. Last lesson you looked at waterfalls and V-shaped valleys. This lesson we're going to go on to look at meanders and floodplains. To start us off, we're going to start with a quick quiz. Some of these questions you've done before, but I wanted to refresh these in particular because I think they will be useful for the rest of the lesson. What you need to do is put 1 to 7 in the margin and just put the answers. Here are your answers. Please check, see if you got them right. If you did, well done, tick them. If you didn't, just put a cross next to it and write the correct answer. Now, I've already said today that we're going to be doing about meanders first of all, but how many of you actually know what a meander is? See if you can tell me now. So, a meander is a bend in a river. Now, this famous picture, hopefully you might recognise it as the River Thames flowing through London, is bending its way through London as it works its way towards the sea. It's flowing from west to east in this direction. You might recognise some of the landmarks. For example, one that sticks out of me is the O2 Arena, or the Millennium Dome, as you might think of it. Anyway, so this is what meanders are, and we're going to look at these first of all. So I brought us back to this picture that we looked at last lesson. So this is the long profile of a river, looking at a river as it moves and changes from source to mouth. Last lesson you looked at V-shaped valleys and waterfalls. They tend to happen mostly in upper and middle courses of the river. We're now going to look at floodplains and meanders. So meanders and floodplains tend to happen more towards the middle and lower courses of the river. You see how this river is relatively straight, although it will have some meanders in it, but the meanders really begin to widen up as you get into the middle and lower course. You'll also get floodplains, but this picture isn't great for showing that. So here is the first key task for today. Firstly, I would recommend watching the clip here, which is a little BBC clip explaining meanders. Now, and once you've done that, I want you to answer these questions. So if you were racing a dinghy from A to B on the river, what route would you take? You have to stay in the river. What route would you take? Would you stay in the middle of the river, or would you go from side to side? Have a little think about that and write down an answer. Secondly, which three number labels, so I've labelled 1 to 6 here, which three number labels show deposition has occurred? So where deposition is where material is dropped, so rocks and sand and so on is dropped down. Question 3, which three number labels show that erosion has occurred? Remember, lots of different types of, well, 4 different types of erosion. Probably the key ones here would be hydraulic action, the force of the water, and abrasion, where rocks are chucked at the side or the bank of the river. And then question 4, what do you notice about where these are? So what we mean by that, where do we find the erosion and where do we find the deposition occurring on the meanders? So are they on the inside or on the outside? So here are the answers to the questions on the previous slide. They are written down, but I will go through them as well. So question 1, if you're racing a dinghy from A to B, what route would you take? Would you stay in the middle or would you go from side to side? Well, if the river was very straight, then it would be a good option to stay in the middle, because often on a straight river, the fastest part is the middle. However, this river is meandering, it's bending around a lot. And so you would want to go from side to side, sticking towards the outside of the meander. So if you were going from A to B, the fastest route would be to move towards 2, then to move towards 4, and then to move towards 6. That would keep you towards the outside of the meanders and where the water is flowing deepest and fastest. Question 2. Which three number labels show deposition has occurred? Well, hopefully you might spot that 1, 3 and 5 are where this has occurred. Now at each of these you should be able to just spot a tiny little beach almost. These are called slip-off slopes or bluffs. Now this is where the river is quite shallow and moving quite slowly, so any material that's been carried at that point will be dropped, and this is what creates these little beaches or slip-off slopes. Question 3. Which three number labels show erosion has occurred? Well, here you should notice that it's 2, 4 and 6. These are on the outsides of the bend where the river is flowing deepest and fastest, and they are eroding what we call river cliffs. It's like the steepest way into the river. The reason why the water is deep on this side is because it's on the outside of the bend. You get something called centrifugal force. You experienced this before. So if you've once you've been in a car, for example, and you go around a bend, your body weight naturally pushes over towards the outside of the bend. So you move from one side to another. This is a centrifugal force, and the same thing happens to rivers when they're going from side to side. What do you notice about where these are? So as I mentioned, you get deposition on the inside of the bend and erosion on the outside of the bend. What's cool about meanders is that it looks like that's how it's always been. But if I could like get a camera and do a time lapse over thousands, hundreds, thousands, even millions of years, what you'll notice is that this river would look a little bit like a wiggling worm. It waves around and moves. It's what we call a transient feature. It never stops. It never stays in one place for a very long time. It moves all over the place. Because you've got that erosion moving it towards making those bends wider and deposition on the inside. So you've just got to imagine how these rivers wiggle around over thousands and millions of years. Second little task on meanders. What I want you to do is I want you to do a simple sketch like this of a cross section of a meander, okay, a bend in a river. What I want you to notice is that X is on the inside of the meander and the Y is on the outside of the meander. Now, you can see these white boxes on labels. Now, what I want you to do is to draw this diagram and then write the correct labels in the right places. The answers are on the next slide. Here are the answers. Please tick any that you got right and cross and just correct any in a different colour which you got wrong. Just to highlight the use of centrifugal force. So this is a fairground ride on a right. You might have been on one before. What it does, it spins around, and because of that, it forces you to the outside. The centrifugal force forces you to the wall around the outside, and therefore it can spin you high up into the air, and there's no chance of you falling out. And they don't even need to attach you in with anything. You just stand there, and it forces you to the outside. It's quite sick-inducing, but it's good fun as well. Now, it's the same force that happens on a meander. The centrifugal force forces forces the water to the outside of the bend where the river cliff is. You get lots of erosion. The inside of the bend is much slower moving, and you'd get deposition, the slip-off slope. So in this fairground ride, if you somehow manage to work your way in towards the middle, you'd be moving relatively quite slowly, and you would easily fall out. So, what is a river floodplain and what are their uses? Have a look at these pictures and I'll explain in a moment. So, a river floodplain is a flat area of land either side of a river which is likely to flood or prone to flooding. They're largest and most likely to occur in the middle and the lower courses of the river. Now, they have many uses. The two key ones really is for farming. Farming is the best use of it, in my opinion. Because when the river floods, it releases lots of sediment onto the ground, some silt and so on, and it brings with it lots of nutrients. This means that the farmland or the area around the rivers in the floodplain is highly fertile and great for growing crops. It also doesn't matter too much if the river floods and those crops are destroyed. It doesn't matter, it's not the end of the world. Another use, or an increasing use of floodplains, is to build on them. This is because the area of land is quite cheap, and also people feel that they can protect the river from flooding that area of floodplain by using man-made walls like levees and so on to protect from flooding. This can be a dangerous thing to do because the river will flood and will eventually break flood defences, and the chances of flooding is also increasing with climate change. So here is the last key task for you today. What I want you to do is put a little subheading, what is a river floodplain? Watch this Time for Geography clip here, it's really good for explaining floodplains. Jot down the definition. A floodplain is a wide valley floor on either side of the river that occasionally gets flooded. And then I want you to answer these questions. So write the question or write your answers in full sentences, and the answers are on the next slide. So here are your answers. They are written down, but I will go through them as well. So question 1, how is a floodplain made wider? Well, the river and its meanders constantly move around and widens the floodplain over thousands to millions of years. Remember what I said about meanders, they don't stick in one place. If we was to go to a river meander now and just look at it, you think, well, that's stuck in a place, it doesn't move. But if you could get a time lapse over hundreds to thousands of years, you'd notice that that river moves around like a wiggling worm, basically, moving from one side of the floodplain to the other, and so making that floodplain wider. Question 2. How is the floodplain made thicker or higher? Well, each time the river floods, it will suddenly slow. The river flowing really fast when it's nearly flooded, as there's lots of water in the river, and then it spreads. When it floods and bursts its banks, it spreads out over a large area, which increases the friction dramatically with the floor riverbed, and so slows that water down, which means that it doesn't have a great capacity or competence to carry the rocks that it is carrying and the silt that it is carrying. So it drops off the largest material first next to the river, and then smaller as finer sediment further away. Eventually this will make the floodplain deeper with what we call alluvium, or material deposited by the river. Question 3. Why do people use this land even though it may flood? Well, there's lots of reasons. It's often cheap. It's usually fertile for growing crops because of the silt. It is flat, so easy to use. They're often on beauty spots because they are next to the river. Well done for completing this lesson. We'll come back again for next week.